The sun rose over northern France on June 7, 1944. But for Germany, the dawn was already fading. The sky still smelled of gunpowder. Allied ships lined the horizon like an iron wall. In the fields behind Normandy, German soldiers stumbled through the wreckage of the night before, dazed, bleeding, silent. The invasion they had feared for years had come, and it would not stop. Inside a modest headquarters near La Roche-Guyon, one man stood by the window, watching the smoke drift toward the sea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, once the symbol of German military genius, now looked like a man who could see the end of his country written in that smoke. He didn't say much, only that the war was lost, and that someone had to tell Hitler the truth. It was a dangerous truth in 1944. To speak of defeat was treason. To suggest peace was suicide. But Rommel was no ordinary general. He had seen too much, in Africa, in Italy, and now in France, to believe in miracles. The myth of the invincible Reich had died on the beaches of Normandy. He told his aides quietly, "The enemy's air power, their resources, they are overwhelming. We cannot win by fighting. We must negotiate." They looked at him in silence. Even they knew that saying those words aloud could mean death. For years, Rommel had been the face of German pride, Hitler's favorite general, admired even by the Allies for his chivalry in war. His victories in North Africa had once made him a legend, a hero in a gray uniform who fought with honor amidst madness. But legends are fragile things. In Berlin, men whispered his name with envy. In the Führer's headquarters, suspicion grew. Loyalty was everything in Hitler's Germany, and loyalty meant obedience, not truth. As the tide of war turned, the walls began to close in. Rommel, once free to command vast armies, now found himself cornered by politics, ideology, and lies. He watched his soldiers die by the thousands, not because they lacked courage, but because the orders came from a man who no longer saw reality. He began keeping notes, letters to his wife, Lucy, observations to trusted officers, careful words written in a tone of duty, but beneath them, an unmistakable grief. One of his aides, Captain Helmuth Lang, later remembered, he was still fighting for Germany, but no longer for Hitler. Outside, the world was unraveling. American bombers roared overhead like a storm that never ended. Towns vanished in minutes. The once proud German army retreated across the French countryside, their convoys reduced to twisted steel. And through it all, Rommel kept riding, visiting the front, meeting young soldiers, telling them to hold the line. He could not tell them the truth, not yet. But his eyes did. They say that by summer's end, he looked 20 years older. The man who once embodied confidence now moved like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear. That secret would lead him to the doorstep of destiny and death. In the months that followed, a plan would begin to take shape, a plan to end the war by ending the Führer himself. The July 20th plot. Many of its conspirators would look to Rommel not as an assassin, but as a savior. A man whose name could unite the army, the people, and what little conscience Germany had left. But conscience in those days was a crime. On the morning of October 14, 1944, a black car drove up to Rommel's home in Herrlingen. Two generals stepped out. They wore civilian coats, but the insignia beneath still glinted in the cold autumn light. Rommel knew why they had come. He asked for a few minutes to say goodbye to his wife and son. Then he put on his field marshal's cap, the same one he had worn in Africa, and walked out to the car. He didn't look back. A single ampule of cyanide lay waiting on the back seat. He sat down. He smiled faintly. A moment later, the car was still. The world would be told that he died of wounds from an air attack. But those who knew, those who had stood beside him in Normandy, understood the truth. Erwin Rommel had been forced to make one final choice: to live in disgrace as a traitor, or to die as a soldier. To protect his family, and the last shred of honor left in a broken nation. Before Rommel faced that final moment in the autumn of 1944, the story had already begun to close in on him, long before the poison was poured. To understand his fall, one must first understand the illusion he was trapped in. For years, Germany had lived inside a dream forged by propaganda, cemented by victory, and fed by fear. In the early years of the war, the name Rommel was a banner of triumph. Newspapers called him the People's General. His photographs, the sunburned face beneath a peaked cap, were everywhere. In schoolrooms, on postcards, in soldiers' pockets. To millions, he was proof that Germany could not lose. To Hitler, he was the perfect weapon of image, clean, loyal, untainted by the old aristocracy. But the truth was different. Rommel was a soldier, not a politician. He had no party ties, no interest in ideology. He believed in discipline, courage, and duty, the old values of an army that existed before the swastika. When the war began, he served as commander of Hitler's personal guard during the invasion of Poland. There, he saw the dictator's charisma up close, the hypnotic grip he held over the nation. Like many, Rommel was drawn in. He once told his wife after a meeting in 1939, "The Führer has a will of iron. He listens to no one, but he will lead us to greatness." It was not blind worship, but a soldier's faith. And faith can be the cruelest trap. That faith would carry him across deserts, through victory after victory, until it met the hard wall of reality. In North Africa, under a blazing sun that could melt steel, Rommel fought like no other commander. His Africa Corps became a legend, maneuvering faster, striking harder, and fighting with an honor that even their British opponents respected. To the Allies, he was the Desert Fox, clever, daring, almost mythical. To the German people, he was the symbol of a clean war, a fantasy of decency amid the moral collapse of the Reich. But even then, Rommel had begun to see the cracks. He saw his soldiers starving for fuel while Berlin sent him empty promises. He saw Jewish laborers building fortifications under the desert sun, and he saw that victory came not from courage, but from cruelty, something he would never embrace. By 1943, the dream was over. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Soviet front was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. The Africa Corps was gone, surrendered, shattered, buried in sand. Rommel returned to Europe a national hero, but a man haunted by defeat. When Hitler called him to inspect the Atlantic Wall, the fortifications meant to stop the coming invasion, Rommel went, not out of loyalty, but out of duty. He had seen what Allied air power could do. He knew that if the enemy landed in France with full strength, the war would end within months. He told his superiors bluntly, "If we cannot stop them on the beaches, we will never stop them at all." Few listened. The Nazi leadership was drowning in fantasy, an empire of delusion, where bad news was treason and optimism was law. In early 1944, Rommel toured the coastal defenses from Denmark to the Bay of Biscay. He saw rusting guns, half-trained men, and miles of unguarded coast. He ordered concrete bunkers, tank traps, and minefields built with ruthless speed. He worked day and night, inspecting, arguing, demanding supplies that never came. To the soldiers who met him, he was not a distant field marshal. He ate with them, listened to their fears, and often risked sniper fire just to see what they saw. But he also began to speak differently. In private conversations, his tone darkened. He told his staff, "The Führer no longer sees reason. He believes the Atlantic Wall cannot be broken. But I have seen the enemy. It can." He began to realize the unthinkable, that Germany's greatest enemy was not outside its borders, but within. And then came June 6, 1944, D-Day, the greatest invasion in human history. Rommel was away from his command that morning, visiting his wife for her birthday. The irony would haunt him forever. By the time he returned, chaos had already taken root. Paratroopers scattered across Normandy like ghosts in the mist. Battles raged in hedgerows and villages. The beaches burned with fire and smoke. Rommel drove through the night, past columns of refugees and wounded soldiers, to take command. When he saw the devastation, he knew it was over. The war, the dream, the 1,000-year Reich, all finished. He said it aloud, not as a confession, but as a fact. The war cannot be won. Those words, spoken quietly in a staff meeting, would echo all the way to Berlin. And once they did, the man who had once been Hitler's favorite became his most dangerous enemy. The stage was set. The hero of Germany would become the voice of reason, and for that, he would be silenced. It was early July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy were burning. All across northern France, the sounds of war had changed. No longer the confident rhythm of German artillery, but the deep, relentless thunder of Allied bombers, day and night, shaking the earth. In his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat at a long oak table covered with maps. The front lines were marked in red pencil, but each day, the red shrank a little further east. Outside, aides whispered. Runners came and went, and the air smelled of smoke and exhaustion. Inside, Rommel read the latest reports. Divisions destroyed, bridges lost, commanders missing. He rubbed his temples and said quietly to no one in particular, "We are watching the collapse of an army." Among the men around him that day was a young officer, Captain Helmuth Lang, a loyal aide, sharp and observant. Lang had followed Rommel through Africa, Italy, and now France. He admired him, but lately he had begun to sense a shadow behind the general's calm demeanor. One evening, Lang found him standing alone on the balcony. The night was strangely quiet, only the distant rumble of artillery from Caen. Rommel held a letter in his hand. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Helmuth," he said, "tell me honestly, what do you think will become of Germany?" Lang hesitated. He was young enough to still believe in miracles, but he had seen too much to lie. "If nothing changes, sir, I fear we'll be destroyed." Rommel nodded. The letter trembled slightly in his fingers. "Then we must find a way to end this, before Germany is nothing but ashes." That was how it began, not with a plot or a secret meeting, but with a simple, human thought. It must end. From that moment, Rommel was no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. Not his own, but that of his country. He began to speak more openly with his staff. He questioned Hitler's orders. He told his officers to ignore suicidal commands, to save their men when they could. In a regime built on obedience, such defiance was the beginning of treason. Meanwhile, in Berlin, another drama was unfolding, one Rommel did not start but could not escape. A small circle of officers, diplomats, and intellectuals had decided that only one act could save Germany: kill Hitler. They were not rebels in the romantic sense. They were men of conscience trapped in a machine of death. Among them were Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, General Ludwig Beck, and Karl Goerdeler, men who had served their country, but could no longer serve its madness. They called their plan Operation Valkyrie. Its purpose: assassinate Hitler, seize control of the government, and negotiate peace with the Allies. But they needed someone whose name carried weight, someone the people would trust when the dust settled. And all eyes turned to one man, Erwin Rommel. In their minds, Rommel was the only figure who could unite the army and the people after the coup. He was popular, respected, seen as honorable even by Germany's enemies. If he supported the resistance, victory against tyranny might still be possible, even in defeat. But Rommel was no conspirator. He despised assassination. To him, murder, even of a tyrant, was dishonor. Yet he also knew that silence meant complicity. He met discreetly with a few of the conspirators: Caesar von Hofacker, Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel, men who spoke carefully, as if the walls had ears. They asked for his support. He did not promise it, but he did not report them either. He told Hofacker once, "If I could speak to Hitler myself, I could make him see reason. The war must end, but not through murder." That belief, noble, naive, and fatal, would seal his fate. Rommel still thought he could persuade Hitler that the Führer might listen to him as he once had in Africa. He did not yet understand that in 1944, reason no longer existed in Berlin. By mid-July, the tension in the air was unbearable. Rommel's car was often seen speeding between command posts, his face pale, his uniform unbuttoned at the collar. He hardly slept. He wrote to his wife often, gentle, restrained letters that masked the storm inside. In one of them, he said, "The situation is hopeless. I am trying to do what I can to save Germany, but I fear it is too late." Lucy would later say she felt the distance growing between them, as if her husband were already walking toward something she could not stop. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft near Livarot. Bullets shattered the windshield. The vehicle flipped and crashed into a ditch. Rommel was thrown out, his skull fractured. He survived, barely. But as he lay unconscious in a small hospital room, the world outside moved toward its own reckoning. 3 days later, July 20th, a bomb exploded inside Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg. The plot had begun. And as Rommel lay bleeding in Normandy, his name was already being whispered in Berlin as one of the traitors. The bomb at Rastenburg exploded at 12:42 p.m., July 20th, 1944. The sound tore through the pine forests of East Prussia, a sudden hollow roar that shook the ground and seemed, for one suspended moment, to shake the world itself. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters, smoke filled the wooden conference barrack. Men staggered out, clothes burning, faces bloodied, eyes wide with disbelief. 4 were dead. But Hitler lived, bruised, scorched, and furious. Within hours, the Reich began to close ranks. Phones rang in every headquarters across Germany. SS units moved like a black tide. Names were listed, hunted, crossed out. And somewhere on that growing list, though he was still unconscious in a hospital bed, was Erwin Rommel. In Normandy, the war raged on without him. The Allied breakout had begun. American tanks rolled through Saint-Lô. British divisions pressed toward Caen. The German lines, once proud and disciplined, were collapsing into chaos. The sounds of the front were now constant. The scream of rockets, the thunder of shells, the endless hum of aircraft that filled the sky like metal insects. To those who fought there, it no longer felt like a war. It felt like a storm swallowing the earth. Rommel's staff tried to hold together what was left of the army. General Speidel, his chief of staff, issued orders in his name. Reports still went out signed Rommel. But inside, everyone knew the truth. Their commander might never return. And worse, that even if he did, Berlin no longer trusted him. When Rommel finally regained consciousness days later, his head bandaged, he struggled to speak. The first thing he asked about was the front. The second, the Führer. The doctor hesitated before answering. The assassination attempt had failed. Hitler was alive. Rommel said nothing. He turned away and stared at the wall for a long time. Then quietly, "Then it is finished. Nothing will save Germany now." The Gestapo moved quickly. The July 20th conspirators were being rounded up by the hundreds. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the man who had placed the bomb, was executed that very night. In Berlin, the air smelled of sweat, fear, and gunpowder. Interrogation rooms burned with lights that never went out. Under torture, one name led to another, and soon the web reached Normandy. Hoffacker, Stülpnagel, Speidel, and through them, Rommel. Hitler could not believe it at first. Rommel, the hero of Africa? The man he had once called the greatest field commander of all time? But the evidence was too convenient. Whispered confessions, coerced testimony, fragments of truth twisted into guilt. In Berlin's cold offices, decisions were made quietly. Rommel would not be arrested. He was too famous, too beloved. A public trial would be a scandal, a blow to the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht. No, this had to be handled silently. Meanwhile, in Herrlingen, Rommel had been sent home to recover. He was no longer allowed to command, no longer allowed to speak to his staff. Only the occasional letter reached him. Coded messages from old comrades, updates on the front, warnings whispered between the lines. He spent his days walking through the garden, his arms still in a sling. Neighbors saw him strolling beneath the autumn trees, his son Manfred sometimes at his side. He spoke rarely. When he did, it was often about the men still fighting in France, boys barely 18, holding rifles against tanks. "They're dying for nothing now," he told Lucy one night. "The war is lost, and yet it goes on, because no one dares to say it aloud." He was waiting, perhaps still hoping for a summons from Berlin, a chance to speak to Hitler face to face. But what was coming was not a meeting. It was a sentence. On October 13th, 2 officers left Berlin carrying sealed orders. Their names, General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Meisel. Their mission, deliver the Führer's final decision to Erwin Rommel. They arrived in Herrlingen the next morning. At 12:15 p.m., the black staff car pulled up to the gate of Rommel's home. Lucy saw them from the window and froze. Burgdorf stepped out first, tall, cold, formal. Meisel followed, hat in hand. Rommel came to the door, his uniform immaculate despite his injuries. He greeted them politely, almost cheerfully. They asked to speak privately. For nearly 20 minutes, the 3 men sat together in the study. No one else heard the conversation, but Rommel himself would later describe it to his wife in simple, precise words. "They gave me a choice," he said. "I can go to Berlin and face trial, and you, Lucy, will suffer. Or I can end it myself, quietly. They say the Führer will ensure you are safe, and that I will be buried with honors." Lucy wept. Manfred stood frozen, unable to speak. Rommel took his wife's hand and whispered, "In a quarter of an hour, it will all be over. Do not cry, my dear. I have done nothing dishonorable." He put on his gray field marshal's tunic, the one he had worn in Africa. He placed his marshal's baton on the desk. Then he walked outside into the autumn light. The leaves had begun to fall. The air smelled of earth and rain. He shook hands with Burgdorf and Meisel. Then, turning once toward his house, he smiled faintly, as if to reassure the 2 people he loved most. He got into the car. It drove a short distance down the road and stopped near a wooded hill. There, Burgdorf handed him a small glass ampule. Rommel nodded, broke it, and drank. Within seconds, his body stiffened. His breathing slowed. Then it stopped. By evening, Berlin released its version of the story. The newspapers announced that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of wounds suffered in an Allied air attack. He would receive a state funeral. Hitler sent a wreath. No mention was made of the black car, or the ampule, or the silence that followed. But in Herrlingen, the truth lingered. In the tears of his wife, in the quiet composure of his son, and in the whisper that spread among soldiers across Germany. Rommel did not die in battle. He died because he told the truth. And somewhere, beneath the endless roar of collapsing cities and retreating armies, that truth began to echo. The quiet defiance of a man who saw the end coming and still tried in his own way to save what could be saved. The telegram arrived at dusk. It was brief, bureaucratic, and cold, stamped with the Reich's insignia, signed by General Burgdorf himself. The Führer expresses his deepest sorrow. Field Marshal Rommel has died of his wounds, suffered in action on July 17th. The nation has lost one of its greatest heroes. Lucy Rommel read it twice, her hands trembling. The words blurred, the ink running slightly where her tears fell. She had known what would happen the moment the car drove away that afternoon, but knowing it didn't make it easier. Manfred stood beside her, pale and silent. He was 18, old enough to understand what the telegram didn't say. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows. The village bell began to toll, slow, solemn 13 times. The war hero of Africa, the desert fox, was dead. But inside that small house in Herrlingen, there was no ceremony, no fanfare, only the unbearable quiet of truth that could not be spoken. For 3 days the house was filled with visitors. Army officers came in black uniforms, carrying wreaths. Local officials arrived, rehearsing their condolences. They spoke in hollow phrases. A tragic loss. A loyal soldier. The Führer mourns deeply. Lucy thanked them politely, mechanically. Every word felt like a blade. When the coffin was brought out, draped in a Nazi flag, she stood at the doorway, gripping Manfred's arm. She didn't cry. She couldn't. As the drums rolled and the honor guard lifted their rifles, she whispered, almost to herself, "They killed him, and now they salute him." Rommel's state funeral was broadcast across Germany. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels himself supervised every detail, the speeches, the camera angles, even the music. Hitler did not attend, but his voice was heard through the radio. Rommel was the bravest of the brave, a man who fought with honor for the fatherland. No mention of treason, no mention of poison. Only the myth of a loyal commander who had fallen to enemy fire. To the German people, exhausted, starving, desperate for heroes, it was one last illusion to hold on to. But among Rommel's old comrades, whispers spread. In officers' mess halls, in dim hospital wards, in the barracks of broken divisions retreating east, the story traveled quietly, in fragments. He was forced to choose, trial or suicide. They made him drink poison. Even Rommel wasn't safe. For many soldiers, that realization was the final crack in the wall of faith. If even Rommel could be destroyed by his own side, what was left to believe in? Lucy buried her husband in Herrlingen, on a gentle slope overlooking the valley. There was no cross at first, only a simple stone and a single word carved into it. Rommel. She and Manfred visited every evening, even as air raids thundered in the distance. She would place a small bouquet of wildflowers and sit in silence until the light faded. Sometimes she spoke softly to the grave. Sometimes she said nothing at all. But always before leaving, she would whisper, "They will know one day." That winter, the war came to an end. Hitler was dead. Berlin was rubble. And for the first time in 12 years, Germany woke not to orders, but to silence. In the months that followed, Allied investigators began to uncover what had really happened in those final days. The Gestapo executions, the secret poisonings, the erased names. And among those names, one stood apart. Erwin Rommel, the field marshal who had refused to bend to madness. It was then that the truth began to surface. His surviving officers spoke out. His letters were read. The story of his final day, the black car, the ampule, the quiet dignity, began to spread beyond Germany's ruins. By 1946, even the Allied press was writing it plainly. Rommel chose death over dishonor. He was no traitor. He was a soldier who saw too clearly. Years passed. The Rommel name began to change meaning again, from propaganda to symbol. Schools were named after him. Streets carried his name. His image, once used to glorify war, now stood as a reminder of its cost. But for Lucy and Manfred, the memory was not legend. It was personal. Manfred grew into a calm, measured man, a politician, not a soldier. He spoke rarely about his father, but when he did, it was with the same restraint Erwin had shown in life. He was not perfect, Manfred once said in an interview. But he tried to act with decency when decency was a dangerous thing. Lucy lived quietly until 1971. She never remarried. On her desk, she kept a small framed photograph. Rommel in his Afrika Korps cap, smiling faintly at the camera, the desert sun behind him. In time, history softened its verdict. Rommel was no longer seen simply as the Desert Fox, the daring commander who outwitted the British across North Africa. He became something rarer, a figure caught between loyalty and conscience, courage and duty, power and truth. His story was not one of victory or defeat, but of clarity. The moment when a man raised to obey finally saw what obedience had become. He had believed in honor. He had believed in Germany. And when both were dying, he tried, in his own flawed human way, to save one from the other. Today, if you stand on that hill in Herrlingen, the world is quiet again. The air is clear. The valley below is green. The stone still bears his name. Just Rommel. No rank, no title, no symbols. Only the name of a man who, in the end, chose truth over survival. And perhaps that is the rarest kind of victory there is. The war had ended, but peace did not come easily to Germany. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the nation lay in ruins, cities flattened, families broken, the sky itself blackened by years of smoke and silence. Everywhere people began to ask the same question. How could this have happened? And beneath that question, who had tried to stop it? In the wreckage of that search, one name began to emerge, hesitantly at first, then with growing clarity. Erwin Rommel. In the first months of occupation, the Allied authorities regarded him with suspicion. To them, he was still a German field marshal, a master tactician who had fought ruthlessly across North Africa and Normandy. But as testimonies surfaced, from captured officers, surviving conspirators, even his family, a different portrait began to form. Rommel had not been a member of the Nazi Party. He had never taken part in the atrocities that stained the Reich. And more importantly, he had stood against Hitler, not with violence, but with the quiet courage of refusal. For the Allies, that made him something rare, a German general they could respect. For Germans, he became something even rarer, a mirror of the man they wished their country had been. By 1946, British historian Basil Liddell-Hart published the Rommel Papers, a collection of the Field Marshal's letters, diaries, and battle reports. It was a sensation. Readers across Europe and America were fascinated. Here was the story of a man who fought brilliantly, but not cruelly. A soldier's soldier who treated prisoners humanely, who argued with the SS, who spoke of honor in a war that had none. Churchill himself once remarked, "We have a very high opinion of Rommel. He was a daring and skillful opponent, a great general." That single sentence did more than praise an enemy. It began the slow rebuilding of Germany's dignity through one man's memory. In post-war Germany, Rommel's name took on a symbolic power. He became a figure of national rehabilitation, a way for Germans to remember courage without glorifying tyranny. Streets were named Rommelstrasse. Schools became Rommel Gymnasium. In Bundeswehr classrooms, young officers studied his campaigns, not as propaganda, but as lessons in leadership, decision, and restraint. To a generation raised in the ruins, he represented something almost sacred, the idea that not every German had been blind. Yet even that legacy was not without shadow. Historians would later debate him endlessly. Was Rommel truly part of the resistance, or merely a disillusioned soldier caught in history's gears? Had he opposed Hitler out of moral clarity, or simply because the war was lost? Did his ambition, once so fierce in Africa, blind him to the regime he served for too long? The answers were never simple. Rommel had lived, and died, in the gray space between loyalty and conscience. And perhaps that was why his story endured. Because history rarely offers saints, only men who see too late and still choose to act. In Herrlingen, time moved quietly. Lucy and Manfred tended his grave through the years of occupation, reconstruction, and the slow return of peace. Visitors came from all nations, British veterans, American officers, even former enemies who had once fought him in the desert. They brought flowers, medals, photographs, small offerings to a man they had respected even in war. Lucy would sometimes step out to greet them, her voice calm, her eyes steady. When asked what her husband had truly believed, she would always say the same thing. He was a soldier, but above all, he was a man who could no longer close his eyes. In the decades that followed, Germany transformed. The cities rose again, Berlin rebuilt, Munich alive with light, Hamburg humming with ships. And yet in every ceremony, every remembrance, there lingered a silence for those who had stood against the darkness from within. Rommel's story became part of that silence, a quiet presence in textbooks, in war memorials, in the cautious pride of a nation learning to remember differently. When Manfred Rommel became mayor of Stuttgart in 1974, it was more than symbolic. The son of a field marshal who had defied Hitler was now serving in a democratic Germany, one built not on fear, but on conscience. And when he was asked about his father's legacy, he replied simply, "He taught me that obedience is not always duty. Sometimes duty is to say no." In time, even filmmakers, writers, and historians would return to Rommel's story, trying to understand what it meant to resist from within a system built on obedience. Was his defiance too late? Perhaps. Was it enough? History rarely gives enough. But what mattered, and still matters, is that in the final months of a collapsing world, one man stood between blind faith and moral clarity, and chose the latter, knowing the price. Rommel's death was not a victory. It was a warning that silence in the face of evil is not loyalty, but surrender. Today, if you walk through the cemetery in Herrlingen, his grave remains simple. No grand monument, no military emblems, just a stone, weathered by time, beneath the whispering trees. Visitors leave pebbles, flowers, and sometimes handwritten notes. Many of them are from soldiers, German, British, American, all writing the same thing in their own words. You fought with honor. You tried to save what could be saved. You were one of us, human. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember him. Not as a hero or villain, not as a perfect man, but as one who lived in the storm and tried, however imperfectly, to find a light. History has a way of simplifying. It wants its Rommels to be heroes and its Hitlers to be monsters, its wars to have clear sides and its endings to bring peace. But real history, the kind that lives in diaries and last letters, is far more complicated. It is written in hesitation, in doubt, in the soft steps of men who see the truth and cannot unsee it. Rommel was one of those men. And perhaps in the end, that is why his story still matters, because it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there were those who tried to remain human. The war was over, but for Germany, it was not an ending. It was a reckoning. The ruins of Berlin still smoked. The air still carried the bitter scent of ash and iron. And across the continent, millions wandered through a wasteland of shattered empires and unanswered questions. For those who had fought, there was no triumph, only survival. For those who had believed, there was only shame. And for those who had dared to doubt, like Erwin Rommel, there was silence. When the Third Reich fell, its myths fell with it. But not all at once. In the early years after 1945, Germany was divided, not just by walls or occupation zones, but by memory itself. Some refused to speak of the past. Others could not stop remembering it. And among them, Rommel became a figure both admired and disputed, the ghost of a Germany that might have been honorable if only its conscience had awakened sooner. The Allied powers, rebuilding Europe from the ashes, understood the weight of that symbol. They needed a story to tell, not just of defeat, but of redemption. Rommel, the desert fox, became part of that narrative. In classrooms, his name was spoken as an example of the good German. In war colleges, his tactics were studied, dissected, even admired. And in the hearts of ordinary people, his face, once feared by his enemies, became the image of a soldier who had seen too much and chosen too late. But history, like war, is never clean. In later decades, scholars would look closer, peeling away the layers of myth. They found a man loyal to Hitler for far too long, a commander who believed in the Führer's vision, until the vision turned to madness, a strategist whose brilliance delayed the inevitable, giving tyranny more time to breathe. Rommel's greatness was real, but so were his contradictions. He was neither saint nor sinner, but something infinitely harder to define, human. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because the tragedy of Erwin Rommel is not just the tragedy of a general, it is the tragedy of an entire generation. Men who grew up believing in honor, obedience, and duty, only to discover too late that those words had been poisoned. Rommel's final act, his acceptance of the cyanide, was not an act of glory. It was an act of mercy. To save his family, his name, and perhaps a small fragment of the Germany he once loved. That choice, made in silence on an autumn afternoon in 1944, still echoes through the corridors of history. It asks a question that no victory parade can answer. When obedience becomes evil, what is duty worth? In the years that followed, Rommel's family carried that burden quietly. Lucy lived until 1971, her devotion unbroken, her voice calm when speaking of the man who had been both husband and soldier. Their son Manfred, born in the shadow of the Third Reich, matured in the light of democracy, became a symbol of the Germany his father never saw. As mayor of Stuttgart, he welcomed Jewish communities back to the city. He visited Israel. He spoke openly about guilt, responsibility, and the moral courage his generation needed to rebuild what had been destroyed. It was as if he had inherited not his father's rank, but his conscience. In Herrlingen, the seasons continued their slow rotation. The trees above Rommel's grave grew tall, their branches whispering in the wind. Children walked past on their way to school, not always knowing who rested beneath the stone, only that he had been a soldier who said no. And perhaps that is enough. Because history, in the end, is not made of monuments, but of memory. And memory does not live in marble. It lives in people. If you stand there now, on a cold morning, you can hear the same silence that filled the air on the day he died. A silence that belongs not to victory, but to understanding. Somewhere in that stillness, the past and present meet. The sound of engines fading, the footsteps of soldiers long gone, the whisper of a world that almost lost its soul. Rommel's story is not about a perfect man. It is about a man who opened his eyes when it was almost too late, and in doing so, left a warning that still matters, that conscience, once awakened, cannot be silenced. The camera lingers, the forest breathes. And for a moment, time itself seems to hold its breath. Then, a single gust of wind passes through the leaves. The world moves again, and in that moment, the story of Erwin Rommel becomes what all great war stories become. Not an ending, but a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity flickers, fragile yet unbroken. The war ended 80 years ago, but its echoes have never faded. They live, in diaries, in medals left in drawers, in the quiet gaze of black and white photographs that refuse to age. Among those faces, one remains unforgettable. The lean, sharp profile of a man looking into a horizon he would never reach. Erwin Rommel. A soldier who believed in loyalty and learned, too late, that loyalty, without conscience, can destroy everything it was meant to protect. There is a moment, if you study history long enough, when the pages stop being ink and begin to feel like skin. You can almost feel the heartbeat beneath them, the choices, the fear, the silence. Rommel's story lives in that pulse. It is not the story of victory. It is not even the story of redemption. It is the story of awakening, of a man who walked too far into the storm and realized that the compass he had trusted was broken. And yet, even in that ruin, he found the courage to face truth. That courage did not change the outcome of the war. It did not save millions or bring back the dead. But it did something almost as rare. It left a mark on how we remember what war truly is. Because history is not built only by those who win, but also by those who see clearly, when seeing hurts the most. Rommel's final hours, the silent drive, the cyanide capsule, the farewell glance to the horizon, have become part of that collective memory. Not as legend, but as a warning, that even the greatest generals can fall to the smallest lies, that patriotism, without question, becomes blindness, that the real battlefield is not always the desert or the sea. Sometimes it is the human heart, choosing between obedience and truth. In the long corridors of time, war strips everything away, medals, titles, uniforms, until only the person remains. And in that last reflection, what matters is not how many battles one won, but whether one dared to open their eyes. Rommel did, and that small act, in a world drowning in propaganda and fear, was enough to outlive the Reich itself. Today, when soldiers walk through the military academies of Europe or America, they still study his maneuvers. But beyond the tactics, they also learn the question his life left behind. At what point does duty end and humanity begin? It is a question that has no clear answer, only the weight of memory. Somewhere in southern Germany, the wind still moves through the trees above his grave, a sound so soft it could be mistaken for breath. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint rhythm of marching, not of armies, but of time itself, carrying forward the stories of those who dared to think differently, even when the world demanded silence. The camera fades, the sound of the wind lingers, and in the final frame, not a portrait, not a battlefield, but a single empty road disappearing into mist. Because in the end, Rommel's legacy, like all who lived through that war, is not about where they stood, but what they stood for. And that is why his story remains, not as a celebration of a soldier, but as a quiet testament to the cost of conscience in a world at war.